Christmas is upon us, as you can tell, and it is the season of giving. And most of the time it's attributed to giving materialistic things, but often we also forget about how important it is to give love and attention to our loved ones, to our friends, to the things that we've taken for granted, and the bastard childs that go completely unnoticed despite putting in the effort. Does it sound familiar for those of you who play Batman games in general? Then yes, that game that you're probably materializing in your head is probably overdue for some very much needed TLC. And that game is, of course, Batman Arkham Origins. And since I was getting into the festive Christmas spirit and Arkham Origins takes place on Christmas Eve, I figured it was time to revisit what is often considered the red-headed stepson of the entire Arkham series, because it wasn't developed by Warner Bros. Montreal, because it didn't feature Kevin Conroy and Mark Hamill reprising their respective roles of both our main hero and villain of this cornerstone of the DC universe. And are we at a point in the timeline where it's not only overdue for a repackaged, re-release, or remaster of Arkham Origins, but I would dare propose a full-blown remake of Arkham Origins, especially after how badly their superiors at the time, Rocksteady, have frankly kind of tanked in the form of Suicide Squad Killed the Justice League, and then even Montreal's very own shaky release with Gotham Knights. I think it's probably time that a very surefire bet in the form of a Batman Arkham Origins remake is probably their best utilization of this property. And considering where we're at right now with WB Games and in the midst of all these like buyouts and bids and acquisitions, whether or not Netflix or Paramount or some kind of third party that we don't even know about at the time of this recording is going to come through and save that avenue of Warner Brothers, here's what I'm hoping will make it onto the nice list by then. Alright, now that I kind of put away the beard a little bit since it was itching a little bit on my face and allows me to speak a little bit more comfortably, let's recount a little bit of what those initial reactions were to Batman Arkham Origins back in 2013 when it was released. Probably the worst year to release a game that was already being burdened by the stigma that it wasn't developed by Rocksteady, it wasn't going to be featuring the voices of Kevin Conroy and Mark Hamill as both the Batman and Joker respectively, and thus was being substituted by Roger Craig Smith and Troy Baker in those respective roles. So you have this come out with that level of scrutiny, and then being tossed up against a year that saw the releases of The Last of Us, BioShock Infinite, and Grand Theft Auto 5. Jesus Christ. Combine that with the initial things that they were talking about, since the title is called Arkham Origins, it was going to throw it back to Batman being the Dark Knight for about a couple of years. Some of the characters that you've come to grow and love and even feel have been sort of refined by the iconography that Rocksteady put in their place with their initial games, Arkham Asylum and Arkham City. And they were going to be kind of pulled back, maybe diluted somewhat, considering, like I said, we're kind of reverting a little bit in the timeline. And that resulted in like so many, what was it, like 7s and 8s. It was always in that middle passing grade of like a C, C+, or even a B-. It was never really going to be able to breach those things. And I feel like it was definitely the kind of game that demands, is almost needed for a revisit after about a decade or so, to see if that really was warranted, or if perhaps we were on it a little too harshly. And with a somewhat spicy up new PC that still dealt me a couple of blue screening problems at the very beginning, I managed to finally refine the settings to boot up Arkham Origins on Steam, because it's going to be a little bit of a chore to pull up and string together and jerry-rig all of the different cables and hookups in order to get my PlayStation 3 to connect to my modern hardware, be able to capture it. I'll be able to run it at least somewhere between 1080p to 2K, but most importantly, 60 FPS with shaders, volumetric rays, the works, to make sure that this is a much better experience, at least from a visual standpoint, than what I dealt with back in, I think it was maybe, in fact, 2013, if not maybe 2014, after a little while of hearing of this lukewarm reception that it received. And just for full disclaimer, I did have the season pass installed because it was actually just 75% off most recently, so I figured buy it at the very last minute and install it. But what I did not install is just to kind of play it safe and not taint or screw up or accidentally delete any portions of my experience for this playthrough that was needed, that I needed footage for. I did not go to the extent of installing any kind of Nexus mods. I understand that that's one of the privileges of playing this on PC with the different things that you can kind of tinker with and manipulate, but at the same time, didn't want to run the risk of just completely screwing up the entire production. Though in retrospect, they could have maybe benefited from some of those mods, because after going through a list one time when I was bored and started to kind of go down the list of different things that they've added to kind of optimize the experience of Batman Arkham Origins on PC, I noted that some of the more highly rated mods were those of kind of peaking the game to its utmost potential in the form of being able to skip those opening splash logos, to then optimizing a little bit of the resolution, cleaning up the suit post-game, since it does have a bit of a problem of giving you the ability to switch your suit back to a pristine condition, since it carries over that trait from the previous Arkham games where you kind of take in that battle damage, which is cool for realism, but you gotta have to allow a little bit of that ability to switch back to a cleaner form of the suit, because some of us want to see it in its prime. But at the same time, like I said, the reason for why I want to highlight some of those optical amplifications in the form of mods is because despite still running at 60 FPS and being cleaned up a little bit because of what anti-aliasing and whatnot allows, you are then quickly still reminded that this is, after all, a 360 PS3 era game with a little bit of jank to the presentation. Characters limp sync are a little bit strange. You got some floaty, weird head movements with some of the characters. Some of the textures are a little bit on the overly sharp side when it comes to like the edges of the building, thus leading to an awful lot of JPEG style sort of maps right dead center that you can't help but sort of notice when you're kind of breezing down corridors or kind of going up against a wall. And I'll admit, from time to time, I kind of had my fair share of like nostalgia feeling for some of these jankiness animations to, like I said, the way characters kind of interact with each other in game, because it sort of reminded me of that PlayStation 3 360 era of me trying to burn through as many Assassin's Creed games as possible that I would pick up from GameStop. Some of the jankiness and robustness of like classic Rockstar games like Bully and GTA 4, which is personally my favorite GTA over 5. It said what it said. So there was a little bit of that, and then there was another part of my brain that was thinking that maybe the reason for why it comes off as so 6th gen is because of how jarring it is to then cut to these super overly stylized and over-rendered CG cutscenes in between missions that are doing a little bit too hard with the cinematography. Things look a little bit overly smoky. It could be maybe a residual symptom of blowing this thing up to a higher resolution than what was anticipated on the PS3 at 360. There's a possibility that maybe the resolution on those native consoles weren't even 1080p, was like goddamn maybe 720p or 800, 900p at very best. So this would result in a little bit of the pixelization that I found from time to time. But even outside of the resolution, the cinematography baked in can sometimes go a little too J.J. Abrams for my liking, where you got some lens flaring and some smoke effects that kind of obstruct what I'm even seeing at the time. So sometimes I'm kind of like, what exactly? I just saw like a big blotch of black. I'm assuming that that was Batman that was jumping across the screen there. And it doesn't really help that these are also affixed to 30 FPS, so it kind of makes it a bit more obvious that they're pre-rendered CG cutscenes, never really connected to the main gameplay. Albeit, it also results in probably one of the things that I would add to the list regarding that aforementioned remake, or at least what I would love to see in an Arkham Origins remake. And don't get it twisted, I did come across a handful of visual hiccups and technical glitches, a couple of which are still plaguing the game on PC all these years later. Now, I'm not gonna go as far as to maybe claim that it's as broken as Arkham Knight was at launch, because that was way too notorious for its own good, but I will admit that I had a couple of restarts that I needed to do with Arkham Origins, resulting in some close downs of the game, a couple of crashes at the beginning. But to me, I think the one that was a bit more on the disappointing side is seeing that a fast travel system baked into the open map of Gotham here in this game that I found to be quite intuitive and helpful for my 34-year-old has, would also result in a little bit of some staggering with the loading screens, to where I was sitting there in front of that Batwing animation for a little bit too long, only to then realize that, yeah, I think I need to close down the game because I think it's gone. But Montreal is able to save themselves from these hindrances, these technical hindrances, by making sure that the fundamental DNA, the aesthetical principle of what makes Arkham, the Arkham games Arkham, is sort of still kept intact here. And I find it pretty surprising of how well WB Montreal were able to capture the framing of the camera from over the shoulder for whenever Batman is in a neutral position versus pulling out when he engages in either stealth or combat, the way that the sound effects as well as the music kind of work in favor of the aesthetic, specifically the sound effects that feel like they're more than likely were sent over from Rocksteady to then WB Montreal via a Google Drive or some kind of USB. Quite literally, it's copy and paste. But here, it sort of helps since it's supposed to be a prequel that then leads into the aesthetic of those games, while at the same time, the music could sometimes lean a little bit towards the generic that you would expect from a Batman adventure, but at the same time, it has a couple of notes and motifs from time to time that are either pulled from royalty-free Christmas tunes that are then manipulated in a way that fits the Dark Knight's aesthetic, while at the same time also sort of leaning a little bit to, again, the tone that you would sometimes pull from the classic themes that Nick Arundel was able to compose for Asylum and City. It just had a tendency to sound a little edgier and angrier at times, but at the same time it sort of fits for the prequels taking place during a time where Batman was probably at his edgiest. So it sort of matches those themes and those spiritual sort of connections that are happening with the character. And what also helped me fully more immerse and sort of buy that this is in fact a prequel was an awful lot of like the UI aesthetics, to at the same time making sure that everything just works in favor of the actual look of and framing of the game. As far as Batman's movement, it never felt like anything got lost in the translation. So looking back, I think that's kind of a feat that WB Montreal probably should have earned a little bit more respect now, all things considered. And to go back to that initial point about Batman being at his edgiest, he is angry. Don't make no mistake. This is probably the angriest that we've ever seen Arkham Batman really be portrayed, considering that this is Bruce in his tenure as Batman for only about 2 years. So he is fresh, he is green, but at the same time, he doesn't necessarily have the calm, cool, and collective demeanor that Conroy was able to convey in those initial games. So here, they were going for something that was a little bit more on the naive side, to where he is teetering at the edge of that abyss. So to have Batman be portrayed in this way, it leads to a fiery relationship between him and Alfred, a pretty much non-existent relationship between him and Gordon, since Gordon still has his suspicions as to whether or not Batman should be brought into custody, and doesn't really feel the need to work with him at the basis that he is in those prior 2 games. And this does kind of make me think about how we should have taken it a little bit easier on Roger Craig Smith's portrayal of Batman taking over for Kevin Conroy, because I know that everybody really loves Kevin Conroy, and they did then, but albeit to a fault, to where I don't think were willing to listen to Craig Smith's take much fondlier. So here, I think to myself that if someone was to definitively pick up the mantle after the untimely and very tragic passing of Kevin Conroy, it practically would be Roger Craig Smith, since he was able to hold his own. Albeit at times he does sound a little bit overly edgy and a little bit overly dramatic as Batman, considering that sometimes he kind of drags on a little bit of his verbs and diction. But at the same time, there are times where he is able to strike a very careful balance of a much more youthful Batman that will eventually sound like Conroy. And I know that there's going to be a corner of the internet that's practically tired of hearing about Troy Baker at this point, but there's a reason for why he's casting everything, is that's because he's a damn good voice actor, or damn good actor, period, considering that his take on the Joker, despite having a few patchy moments here and there where you can blatantly tell it's not Mark Hamill, it comes very damn close. One other character that I do want to highlight real quick, though, is actually not a human or a anthropomorphic one in the sense of the word, but rather a establishing setting, which would have to be Gotham itself, because after City, I feel like at that point, the genie's kind of left out of the bottle of not being able to interpret Gotham as a character in and of itself, since you're kind of traversing the majority of the setting for the bulk of the game. And I'll admit that I was missing a little bit of that Art Deco approach to the city of Gotham, or to the architecture of Gotham, the way that Rocksteady was able to implement. But I would argue that WB Montreal was able to fill in a very happy medium in the middle, where you see a few modern tendencies with the design of some of these buildings, while at the same time having a few font headings and neon lights that are very reminiscent of your time in Arkham City, let alone in the future when you were going to be dropped back in there in Arkham Knight. But I'll admit that I was kind of having a bit of a difficult time trying to find those things that I was very happy with the setting, considering that they did opt in for that classic excuse of trying to explain exactly where all the citizens of Gotham went in, and that was because this snowstorm that happens to barrel on Christmas Eve did in fact snow and entrap an awful lot of these citizens. Therefore, a curfew was enacted to make sure that the criminals that are usually stalking the streets are practically the only real human interactions that Batman's gonna have in those streets. So at times, this also made in due to a technical hindrance that Montreal didn't really have to burden themselves with, which is to populate the city and making sure that the whole thing will hold its own without crashing PCs, let alone consoles. But at the same time, it makes sure that everything felt pretty technically and sound from both a visual and audio sense. But one of the things that I was genuinely surprised with this new playthrough after, like I said, about almost a decade and a half since its release, is actually the gameplay. Because that's a feat unto itself. How do you take the gameplay that was established by two games from a previous developer, not only take it upon yourselves as a different developer from that one, but then make it a prequel so that it feels like it's forward progressing and backwards progressing at the exact same time? Well, that's where I noticed this time around, much better as an adult, that they decided to not necessarily reinvent the core three pillars of what makes Batman in these games, which is stealth, combat, and detective work, but frankly just kind of throw the scales off just a bit in their favor, to where it almost kind of becomes a bit of a strength. The way Batman feels in this game is pretty much carried over from the previous games. Like I said, I feel like somewhere down the line they managed to legit email, and I'm oversimplifying things, but they frankly just sent over the engine to WB Montreal and said, here, refine it, make sure that it works on your guys' computers, and you guys are good to go. And frankly, that's kind of how it still feels all these years later, but still sort of kept intact with the majority of how Batman traverses across Gotham when it comes to running, climbing, bouncing, gliding. Though I will admit that at times the propulsion of sort of grappling up to certain surfaces via one of the bumpers feels a little slow. I don't know if that was just me, but maybe it's because of coming off the heels of Arkham Knight with those supporting upgrades to make sure that things feel a little bit quicker and faster and are able to expedite you across the city when it comes to gliding and traversing. Aside from the obvious Batmobile, there are times where it feels just a little too slow for comfort here in Arkham Origins, which is strange considering that he then picks up quite an awful lot of speed on the upswings of his glide, especially when you're doing that very harsh, straight down deep dive up to then catch a drift and being able to glide at a much higher, faster rate. Though I'll admit that that was still not able to kind of distract me from some slight frustrations that I still felt even with City, so I guess this is not necessarily a discriminatory thing with devs, considering that I still found myself sort of frustrated at kind of heading face on into certain structures because of how they were placed on the map versus some frustrating parts where he just wouldn't climb up a ledge. I don't know if that was sort of contributed to that 6th gen jank that I was complaining about before, but that was still nevertheless found here, even playing through the game on PC. But one thing I was able to notice on a much more positive note would have to be how out of those three pillars that I mentioned before, the one that this game emphasized probably the most in favor of, again, story and where we're at in Batman's mental state with him only donning the cowl for about 2 years would be combat. Because this game, again, this could be potentially a hot take, but my observation after this new playthrough would be that they definitely focused a bit more on the fighting and on the combat encounters, more so than on those prior two pillars that I mentioned regarding detective work or stealth mechanics. Don't get me wrong, they're all still present here. You're still finding yourself in the midst of crime scenes, trying to solve murders and making sure that you're able to kind of pick up a little bit on the breadcrumbs, and introducing the whole rewind mechanic with the holograms to then kind of jump back in time to see exactly how a crime was even committed in the first place is a very innovative touch from a visual standpoint. Albeit now, it's kind of difficult to not sort of divorce yourself from the notion that you're simply just hitting the A button in my case, and you're simply just kind of pressing the triggers to then rewind and play back. It's almost like a point and click approach to this detective work. And also it kind of introduces a bit of a plot hole. Why is this here in a prequel game and not really present in Asylum or City? It probably would have saved Batman an awful lot of time if this functionality inside of his cowl was present in those other two adventures. And that's not the only form of gadget that is presenting a bit of a plot hole. Regarding this new line launcher that he acquires via a boss encounter, why is it that that's not present in other stealth portions in the other two games that's then replaced by the zipliner? I understand the zipliner is pretty cool for being able to kind of maneuver through different heighted elevation parts of the building or the room of which you're taking down these guys, Predator style. But I gotta be honest, there are times where I felt ultra satisfied of launching this little device or projectile that will then launch another tightrope that I can then utilize to then implement tightrope takedowns, or my personal favorite, being able to either connect two guys together to then knock into each other, or taking like a gas canister to then incapacitate one of the thugs with guns and being able to reduce my numbers. I love doing that with this little line launcher or whatever the thing it was called, with the little like ball and the hooks. And it's probably one of the things that I really wish would make some form of return in the Arkham games. And it's providing a little bit of a plot hole, and it's also not helping out the fact that during some of these stealth Predator encounters, some of the AIs borderline dumb to where I was able to take down like 3 or 4 guys in quick succession by just peering around the corner. No, to me, it truly ended up being the combat, the actual fighting mechanics of the game that I felt had the greater strength of the spotlight shine upon it in a way that made me realize that, yeah, they were definitely trying to do this on purpose, since this is supposed to be, like I mentioned before, an edgier, angrier Batman. He's going to be resorting to his fists a bit more, and I felt like I just came across much more fighting encounters than the other two I mentioned it came to be throughout my playthrough. And granted, if you're going to be doing that, then you better make sure that that combat is in fact fun and intuitive and responsive. And I felt like now I can appreciate it a little bit more fonder than I did as a kid, because I truly did pick up on some moment-to-moment encounters where I felt like a little bit of the response for these enemies was a little bit tweaked in the way that these triggering moments, whether it be with either the counters with the little things showing up on their heads to then being able to implement takedowns, was a bit more strategically placed to where I really needed to think about whether I should carry on over with a combo or risk getting bumped outside my head and incapacitated, and therefore exposing myself to maybe some other thug that now happens to be brandishing a rifle. So I felt like there was this very addictive notion to the combat mechanics that I think is probably one of Arkham Origins' now newfound strengths. And I'll admit, the inclusion of the electro gloves definitely sparks things up, and that combined with plenty of other upgrades to then include into your arsenal, whether it be with newfound combos or upgrading your health and any kind of damage that you can intake from the upgrade menu, is definitely something that, again, kind of kept me coming back to these encounters, to the point where even outside of the main story, just kind of gallivanting all over the rooftops, if I found myself with a couple of those bad guys, some of which are brandishing either shields or stun batons, or even some brand new weapons that are very specific to Arkham Origins, from time to time, I would find myself just kind of stopping to see who I can beat up. But no other form of combat encounter stood the test of time and managed to retain the title of probably being the most acclaimed part of this game from when the game released in 2013 till now. And that is the boss fights. I'm not going to pretend to know exactly what the process of the development for the boss fights were or how exactly those meetings went down at WB Montreal, but whoever was responsible for these boss fights, they are more than like the definition of what kids like to say as these days,
cooking.
From the kinetic parries of the Deathstroke duel to trusting your bad intuition with Copperhead to the tongue-in-cheek shortest boss fight ever record breaker of the Electrocutioner, even the reoccurring tussles that you have with Bane, from the one where he's at his weakest to then when he yokes himself up on TN1 there at the end, it almost kind of makes me think that maybe Bane should have been the main antagonist in the first place. And even when we're dealing with some of our main antagonists like Joker, who's albeit probably not even a boss fight to begin with if you really consider it, they at least managed to heighten the experience with little details, whether it be with Joker and those little quick flashes to make it to show exactly how important it is that this is the true fight that kickstarted this for all intents and purposes, relationship between Batman and the Joker, to then straightforward and fun QTEs like the ones with Killer Croc, punctuated by some form of elaborate CG cutscene. However, the actual plot that's sort of stringing and connecting all these boss fights together, not so much. This is probably where I'm going to enter some slight hot take territory, because the initial premise of having Black Mask hire 8 assassins to track down and hunt and more than likely kill Batman on Christmas Eve while everybody else is distracted, considering of how much of a holiday this whole thing is. It is an intriguing premise, and the breadcrumbs that Batman is following to sort of connect the mystery and figure out exactly why it is that he's doing that and how he's able to gain support and to make sure that everybody's locked up good and tight is, again, it keeps us on the hook. But I gotta be honest, now looking back, the whole twist of Black Mask simply just being the Joker again in disguise, and he was truly the one that put out the hit because he was more or less bored. I gotta be honest, it just doesn't really resonate all too well these years later, and sort of kind of takes out a wind under those sails. And after that, I feel like the story just kind of lost momentum for me. Especially when, in the grand scheme of things, Joker's sort of taken out a little bit quickly, especially after you deal with him in that whole Royal Hotel, whatever it's called, level. He's sort of then incapacitated for the remainder of the story, and then afterwards, a little bit of some pacing issues is dealt to the brunt of the plot, especially when even the game almost kind of forgets that there was an initial bounty for, what was it, $50 million by 8 assassins. So retroactively, the game then takes some of those assassins and either pits them as side content, and then at times it almost seems like it almost kind of forgets about them, that they just seemingly kind of get pulled out of nowhere, and it's almost like the game is in real time thinking, oh yeah, I forgot about Firefly. Let's throw him back in there and have him threaten a bridge. It just kind of came out of nowhere. I was like, all right, this is feeling a little padded out. And this padding also sort of echoes a little bit into the side content from Deadshot and Shiva sort of being kind of been there, done that. You're able to sort of breeze through their side missions very easily, to then the escaped prisoners that are simply just elaborate collectathons. And please do not get me started once again on Enigma and his intel. It's just Riddler trophies all over again.
Oh, that poor door. You really should apologize.
Usually in a story, whether it be for a film, a game, or even a TV show, depending on the seasons, a third act turn usually results in the protagonist being at his, her, or their lowest point. And you usually have like a secondary character or some kind of external motivator to then get the protagonist to a point where they can kind of rise up and lead us into the third act climax. And more often than not, I feel like that secondary character results in being Alfred out of all characters, to then give Bruce the motivation that he needs to be able to don the cowl once again and make sure that he accomplishes his mission. So it's pretty refreshing to see that this Alfred in Batman Arkham Origins decides to go against type and instead deals some very harsh, tough love to Batman after calling him out on his bullshit of endangering himself and others in the process, while at the same time kind of going blindly into the darkness, leading to one of the very seminal character moments. And out of all games, it comes out of WB Montreal's outing by having Batman deliver this monologue.
I am. When the mugger or the thief stops to think twice, that is fear. That is what I am. That is why they hired assassins, because I am the reason the criminals breathe easier when the sun rises. So no, Alfred, I am not in over my head. Tonight will not be my end, but it will be theirs.
I think this was the moment that transformed Batman Arkham Origins into the true underdog of the series and managed to give it wings for it to fly in the eyes of so many players since then. And it's probably why it is now considered to be an overlooked gem that was made by people who more than likely cared about the Batman mythology, like true fans tend to do, to make sure that these poignant moments lead to what is effectively the heart of the game, which is Bruce and Alfred's tumultuous relationship. Otherwise, it would have resulted in a very empty adventure that would have then been buried in the shadow of the prestige that Rocksteady has sort of established for themselves just a couple of years prior. And I won't make the argument that it's the only moment in this game that people can maybe extrapolate from and see, hey, look, the devs truly cared at one point, because there's other moments that generally caught my eye and even made me smile a little bit. Despite my criticisms of some of the focal points regarding the story or some of the settings, I do appreciate seeing Ace Chemicals looming in the background, Calendar Man's cell, Joker and Harley's first interaction in Arkham Asylum, then leading to not only the foreshadowment of Quinn's downfall, but also the Red Hood origin story that's teased here. And I couldn't help but grin a little bit at the mentioning of TN1, the serum that then Bane takes to then grow to the size that we've most notably remember from Batman Arkham Asylum. And though the side content wasn't as meaty as it would be found either in Arkham City or in the future in Arkham Knight, there was at least some payoffs that would reward you in the form of either really bountiful XP for you to be able to upgrade in the menus, or some kind of character beat at the end, whether it be in the form of Shiva apprehending Deadshot and Black Mask, and even a couple of other characters that you would have interactions with via comms like Barbara Gordon. The one icy villain was omitted from this lineup of assassins, and that's because he was busy with much more personal matters. As mentioned before, I did manage to pick up the season pass right on the cusp of booting up this new playthrough on PC, and that also led to me playing Cold Heart, the standalone, much more linear DLC that I was anticipating, because I don't remember it being this straightforward, which is kind of refreshing since it gives you a newfound appreciation for some of these other areas that we weren't able to explore before, like the interior to Wayne Manor, or the foreshadowment of that Art Deco that I appreciated from the Asylum and City days in the form of the lobby and even some of the labs inside of GothCorp. But that linearity sort of came off as a little daunting when the game then decides to throw you back into Gotham, only to then realize via the map that certain sections of the city are closed off completely, so you're not really able to explore at the fullest sense of like the core game. So at times I thought to myself that maybe you could have streamlined this a little bit better by not having it turned a little padded, even in and of itself, at only being a 2.5 to 3 hour experience. Could have maybe sort of compartmentalized it a little bit better without having to collect all these different pieces across the city for the cryo drill. And it was a little disappointing to see that one of the best boss fights in Arkham City, Mr. Freeze, is then regulated to simply just a very drawn out and at times sort of frustrating stealth mission here by continuously bringing out more thugs with guns and thus repeating to me having to play a game of cat and mouse with him, which I understand you were doing in Arkham City, though it was much more creative with it. You had to figure out different styles of takedowns, and they sort of tried to give you the notion that you could do that here, except I figured out an exploit, just kind of take out all the bad guys, stand in the middle, and then start cutting down the icicles from the ceiling, and then eventually this will lead you to those latter two phases of the boss fight. So after a while, I thought to myself, okay, this thing is just kind of dragging on a little bit longer than it needed to be. Still though, Mr. Freeze, in my opinion, is one of the more empathetic villains out of the Rogues Gallery, and I feel like he was not at all once betrayed by the writing at play here. The XC suit was badass to not only look at, but also to play with, almost kind of making me wish that it was accessible in the core game, and then tossing in a couple of more villains and these enemy types that you deal with in the battle encounters that are now dealing with cryogenic weaponry sort of varies up those encounters to at least make it a little bit more palatable, that this was actually still, at the end of the day, without my criticisms aside, an enjoyable 3-hour playthrough of the DLC that almost makes it kind of essential to be packed in for a potential remaster or remake. So that brings me to my final request. What would I love to see in a Batman Arkham Origins remake? And to be quite honest, I think I'm landing at my final verdict being a remake, considering that I think so much time has since been removed since that original release in 2013 that a remaster, frankly, is just not gonna cut it. You are at the capacity with the technology and the bandwidth that we can do now, especially with how much demand there is in the video game space for a remake of one of the underdogs of the series. We've already seen Asylum and City and even Night being repackaged and retooled and rebranded as like Return to Arkham or the Arkham Trilogy now on Switch. How about we give some of that attention to detail and care and love to Batman Arkham Origins? And I feel like a very quick way to make money hand over fist is for WB Montreal and some of these original devs to be called in, or be able to contract out some of the better people in the business that are really good at delivering remakes and ports, such as Bluepoint Games, to fully from the ground up rebuild and remake Batman Arkham Origins with modern hardware, modern engines that will make sure that not only the textures will still feel and look great even within a very wintry, snow-riddled setting like Gotham City is here on Christmas Eve, but then making sure that it runs at 4K 60, make sure that you're able to kind of maneuver in between buildings without any very lengthy and sometimes glitchy loading times, being able to swap out suits on the fly, which Arkham Origins was able to pioneer even way back then, that not even Arkham Knight can sort of act upon. You have to like boot out of the game, go back to the main menu, swap out suits, and then go back into Gotham. So that's something that they could definitely still keep in line and make sure that it's implemented, but at the same time making sure that maybe you can kind of treat some of these CG cutscenes the way that they treated Halo Anniversary or Halo 2 Anniversary or the upcoming Halo remake, where they can bake in those CG cutscenes with in-game assets and have it all be streamlined so that it feels immersive, it feels all connected, and at the same time, you're dealing with an experience that is just going to be so beautifully kept up, refined, while at the same time making sure that you're taking the greatest strengths that Arkham Origins has now come to be known for, such as the boss fights, the much more refined kinetic combat encounters that have this very strategic and arcadey approach, while at the same time maybe polishing up a little bit of the AI for the enemies regarding the stealth predator missions, making sure that the detective work feels a bit more layered so that I can truly feel like Batman, like Greg Miller likes to say, only this time I can truly feel like we're the world's greatest detective. And of course, while you're at it, go ahead and toss in Cold Cold Heart, toss in the downloadable skins and the costumes, the full challenge maps, which includes the Deathstroke challenge maps, which allow you to play as the mercenary assassin. And I was genuinely surprised to remember, or re-remember, so to speak, that he pretty much has a completely different moveset for the combat encounters and a completely different set of arsenal gadgetry for the Predator encounters that truly make you think much more differently than Batman, and really makes you strategize of how to approach the enemies, considering that the bow staff, though effective, is not going to be as intuitive as the cape, and definitely not going to be able to utilize as many gadgets to be able to incapacitate enemies during Predator encounters, and makes you a little bit more vulnerable to firearms. And it would also come with Initiation, a form of a prequel to the prequel that is Arkham Origins, showing Bruce Wayne training in North Korea. So a little daunting to see that they kind of erased the entire inclusion of the League of Shadows and any mentioning of Ra's al Ghul, but for it just being a challenge map, it's much more fleshed out than you would expect any of the other ones from previous games to have been, considering you have some in-game animations for some side characters, some voice acting that was then added to the mix, and then on top of that, you have this variety of kind of switching back and forth between this Predator encounters that have a time limit to then some truly grueling and at times frustrating combat encounters that are tougher than your average fare. Though I think they could have dialed it down a bit on that final encounter regarding enemies wielding too many blade weapons to the point where I'm simply just hitting the triangle button and just kind of waiting for them to finish their animations, thus stun locking me at times. But in the midst of all of that, you're also tested at the most possible way to figure out exactly how to strategize certain moves, when to pull back, and when to make sure that you're countering in the offensive. Almost approaching the entire map almost like a fighting game within the Arkham series. And it's truly a gauntlet that pushes you to your limits, topping it off with a Shiva battle that then truly made me feel great about spending an hour, mastering my skill, and finally completing the challenge map. Though I think I could have used a much better ending cutscene than just the guy saying, alright, hit the locker room. Though I could do without the multiplayer, I gotta be honest, though I appreciate with how innovative and groundbreaking they were being at the time with this asymmetric sort of approach to the multiplayer where you get to play as either Batman or Robin on one side and then the other team has to take up the mantle of the thugs to be able to survive. I feel like that's kind of been done to death in the years since. I know that that's not necessarily their fault, but I just feel like I'm so fatigued with asymmetric multiplayer in the forms of the horror genre, like the Texas Chainsaw game, the Ash vs. Evil Dead game, the Predator game, the Dead by Daylight, the Halloween game that's coming up. I'm just so sick of it at this point that I'd rather than just sort of forfeit the multiplayer component, no matter how visionary it was at the time, and simply just pour all of those resources into polishing up the single player experiences and making sure that that is warranting of a $70 purchase. And considering that they pulled the plug on the servers just 3 years after the release in 2016, then my money is that they're not really going to bother with any kind of resources or bandwidth in trying to revitalize it, and that's frankly okay with me. There's nothing so much that can really be done about like the story or my problems with it, but giving this holistic approach to a game that has been treated so badly in the years since, trust me, it's going to make bank, and it's also going to make it clear that it's stories like Batman Arkham Origins, or at least bringing more attention to those character-centric moments like that scene between Alfred and Batman. People still want that. We don't want this slop coming in the disguised as a Suicide Squad game, or a Batman game without Batman, or whatever the hell it is that they're doing over there in DC regarding the property, and not knowing exactly what to do with it. And though it's appreciative to see that a little bit of DNA is still being carried on over from Arkham Origins into the modern landscape, only with a medium that I may not be the biggest fan of, which is VR in the form of Batman Arkham Shadows, by continuing Roger Craig Smith's tenure as Batman and kind of explaining where Enigma has been and the origins of Two-Face and whatnot. I still am yearning for either a continuation of Arkham Origins with a brand new game, or simply just remake the game from the ground up for newer hardware, whether it be found on PC with like the Steam Machine or PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X. And if Santa is able to deliver that, I will be a very, very happy boy. If you guys have anything else on your Christmas wish list regarding Batman Arkham Origins, I'm eager to see what that list will be down in the comment section below. And while you guys are down there, hit the thumbs up button if you guys enjoyed this retrospective look back at the, like I said, the bastard child from the Arkham series known as Arkham Origins. If you guys did not enjoy it, hit the thumbs down. And as always, take care, stay humble, and happy holidays.